Hello, everybody, and welcome to Open Courtauld Hour, the fourth in the current series. But I'm pleased to say that we've enjoyed doing this so much that we've got more in the works, and we'll announce those very soon. We've been kind of building up to tonight's episode, which is, as you know, about art history and especially women artists. That's the feature of tonight. And it is a huge pleasure to be joined by Katy Hessel this evening, who's going to be co-hosting with me. Katy, as I'm sure many of you already know, has an absolutely fabulous Instagram account called @TheGreatWomenArtists, and out of that has a really wonderful podcast. So if, like me, you're a bit insomniac and you listen to podcasts in order to get back to sleep, I would warn you away from hers, because you'll want to listen to the whole hour. So, Katy, I think you're there somewhere. Can I say hello to you? Can you turn your camera on, and then we can have a little natter?
Oh, it just says the host needs to start the video.
Oh, well, at least we can hear you. There we go.
Hello.
Starting your video.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I just wondered if I could ask you a few questions about how you got started. I mean, your Instagram account obviously has had a kind of explosive effect.
Yeah, it's amazing. I started it in October 2015, and I think in the last 5 or so years, we've seen this surge of interest. I think it was a really interesting time when a lot of people were having like-minded conversations. I mean, mine really sparked. I just finished studying at UCL. I studied under the great Tamar Garb, who's a medieval feminist art historian. And she really kind of opened up my mind to this subject. And also, I went to an art fair and I didn't see any artworks by female artists. And I just thought, oh my God, someone's going to do something about it. And luckily we've got this incredible community in London and in the world as well, and so much attention, thanks to the rise of the internet and social media, is now being really put on this important subject.
Yeah, and as I was preparing for tonight, it suddenly occurred to me that we're nearly on the 50th anniversary of the publication of Linda Naucklin's provocative kind of field transforming essay, "Why Are There No Great Female Artists?" And I mean, do you feel like that's a question that you're still kind of pursuing in your work?
I think
I
so.
mean, it's hers. Her question is an ironic one, obviously.
But I mean, she completely, started this huge thing that was a catalyst to what we're still discussing today. And I think it's so important that we should keep referencing her, because she was kind of shouting from everywhere, saying, we need to address this. And that's exactly what my Instagram and podcast aims to do. It aims to actually kind of answer her questions and say, here they are, but I hope I will be doing this as a lifelong career. So I hope there's many decades of it to go, but hopefully I think we've got to go this one way in order to achieve equality, because that's what we want ultimately.
And one of, I guess, the points of her argument is that you need to look at why women up until that point hadn't been so prominent in the art historical sphere, and platform is one of them, and that's what you're doing in your work, isn't it?
Gatekeepers as well. We've got people like Frances Morris, Maria Balshaw in charge now, and I think this is really going to change the whole vision of art history for the next decade. It's going to be exciting.
Yeah, art history and art future. Okay, well, you are going to introduce the idea, the kind of concept for this evening, and our first speaker. So I'm going to turn myself off, so to speak, and hand it over to you. No, actually, that's a lie. I'm gonna introduce our first speaker, and you're gonna maybe say something else now. This is obviously very slick and rehearsed. Shall I? Here, I know what we'll do. I will say that tonight, everyone, can you tweet us, especially if you have questions that you want us to put to our speakers. Katy and I are going to take turns introducing and putting questions. And as she brilliantly pointed out, I'm actually doing the introducing. So tweet us at Courtauld Res with the hashtag Open Courtauld Hour, and then we'll be able to share some of your questions with the speakers that we have tonight. We've got Jo Applin, another UCL, another kind of product. I don't want to call Jo a product, but the great UCL History of Art department. My colleague Ketty Gottardo, who's the Martin Halusa Curator of Prints and Drawings. We have Jade Montserrat, who is a Courtauld alum and has also just submitted her PhD. She's an artist, a scholar, and a poet. And we are now, I think, going to turn to the first chapter in tonight's episode. Does that sound okay, Katy?
Sounds perfect. I can't wait.
Okay, so now now's the time for this. It's a little bit like broadcasting from the Mir space station, I imagine, with this, only without, I guess, the guitars provided by Chris Hadfield, fellow Canadian. I got to get that in. So now, if we can summon the merit-rousing director of the Courtauld, Deborah Swallow. Debbie has been director of the Courtauld since 2004. And before that, she had a long and illustrious career at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where she led many transformations in departments. And Debbie, by training and orientation, is a social anthropologist whose special professional interests are really located in India. And so it is a really great pleasure, Debbie, to welcome you to Open Courtauld Hour, and to talk really not so much, I think, about Indian art, but about another subject that has been a real, I think, passion of yours over these years that you've led the Courtauld.
Thank you.
I can see you too, by the way. Just hello, there you are. Hi.
Thanks so much. It's great to be part of this today's discussion. Yeah, you're right, Alex. You know, India is where I start and probably where I'll end. And during my career, I've admired the work of many women artists outside the formal art world in India and elsewhere. These are untrained in any conventional sense. Their work often ephemeral and performative, socially purposeful, and mostly of little or no of no commercial value. And I thought at first that I would talk about them, those really hidden women artists. Sadly, perhaps, I'm not going to do that. And I just would like to see the first image, which shows some of those women, or at least one of those women, and the sort of work they produce. This is a village which I lived in for some time in the 1970s. But I'm going to disappoint you, I'm not going to talk about that. But I am going to talk to other hidden women in our own institutional history. So forgive me about introspection. The Courtauld is a fascinating institution and community. I say fascinating because I'm both an anthropologist and part of it. It combines specialist teaching and research, as you know, in art history, conservation and curating, and it's got a world-class collection, which it shares as generously as it can. We're currently, again, intensely debating how we engage creatively with the present situation and transform our institution, opening it up and making it as porous as possible. At the same time, we know that we need to explain who and what we are, and where we've come from, and what we're trying to do, in clear and simple terms. Not surprisingly, certainly not to me as an anthropologist, we've developed a foundation mythology and established a lineage. So here's the trio of our founding fathers. The traditional account ran a little like this. Samuel Courtauld, an industrialist and chairman of his family's textile manufacturing company in the early 1920s, had developed a personal passion for Impressionist and post-Impressionist paintings, a passion that put him in advance of much conventional art collecting and thinking in the UK. By giving a dedicated fund for the purpose, he pushed the National Gallery into acquiring key Impressionist and post-Impressionist works so that the wider public could enjoy them. And it was the gift of his Robert Adam House in Portman Square and a substantial part of his personal collection which brought the Courtauld into being in 1932. Arthur Hamilton Lee, first Viscount Lee of Ferrum, GCP, GCSI, GBE, PC, was an English soldier, diplomat, politician, philanthropist, and patron of the arts. He was the ideas man, the organizer who gained the financial backing of Samuel Courtauld and established the Courtauld. Robert Witt, CBE, FSA, is also described as a co-founder of the Courtauld. Born in Surrey of German parents from Hamburg and Frankfurt, he was educated at Clifton College in Oxford, then fought in the Second Matabele War and worked alongside Cecil Rhodes, the war correspondent. He qualified as a solicitor, but was a genuine scholar and relished the description of art historian. Another resident of Portman Square, he created a collection of more than 3,000 drawings, 20,000 prints, and a photographic library which was later given to the Courtauld. But of course, these founders did not live or work alone. And here is where some of these hidden women come in. May I introduce you to Elizabeth, Ruth, and Mary. If we look closer at Samuel Courtauld's life, and without in any sense reducing his genuine significance, we can still gently but firmly revise the picture, as my colleague Ernst Wegelin has done brilliantly in the catalogue of the exhibition A Vision for Impressionism, which we showed at the Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris last year. There's no question that his wife Elizabeth was an essential partner in the evolution of his fascination with art and his emboldened taste. He honeymooned in Italy in 1901, where his first understanding of old masters began and gradually developed. They mixed in the artistic circles of the day. By the early 1920s, his tastes really had evolved. At an exhibition of French art at the Burlington Fine Arts Club, he saw a painting of the Provençal landscape by Cézanne. At that moment, I felt the magic, and I have felt it in Cézanne's work ever since. There was no doubt about his real passion, but what Ernst has discovered is that Elizabeth played a really proactive role in his collecting, so-called, and we should not therefore be surprised that the collection is described as belonging to both of them. Elizabeth deserves more recognition. It was with Elizabeth that Samuel visited the United States in 1927 and went to the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard, one of the inspirations for the Courtauld. She promoted a series of subscription concerts with Sir Malcolm Sargent as conductor and with musicians of the highest caliber. In the same spirit as Samuel's mantra of art for all, these were aimed at people who hadn't previously attended concerts. They attracted large audiences and the orchestra evolved into the London Philharmonic. Significantly, the main period of intensive collecting was during the 1920s, and when Elizabeth died in 1931, Samuel then gave his house and the core collection to found the Courtauld. So what about Arthur Lee? Lee met his future wife, Ruth Moore, during his early diplomatic career in the West Indies and the United States. They married in 1899, just after the death of Ruth's father, a New York banker. She acquired a substantial inheritance, and a year later, Lee retired from the army, turning to a political career and rising to the position of Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries and First Lord of the Admiralty. This, of course, is a classic story of the turn of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. British aristocrat or professional man marries American heiress and goes on to great success. There's no doubt about Lee's intelligence, drive, acumen, and effectiveness. But no doubt, too, that Ruth's money helped them to purchase their country home checkers, helped with the acquisition of both his first collection, which he gave with checkers to the nation in 1917, and the second, more informed collection of works of art, which had become part of the Courtauld's collection. Witt likewise was married. In 1899, he married Marie-Hélène Martin, a fellow Oxford student, who, like him, collected photographs and reproductions of works of art. Their joint collection, eventually exceeding 500,000 items, is now over 2 million, was housed at their home at 32 Portman Square, London. The Witt Library was the world's largest archive of reproductions of paintings and drawings and turned their home into an international study centre for scholars of art history. And it inspired Helen Clay Frick to make a parallel collection in the United States. As we heard before, the Witt collection was bequeathed to the Courtauld on the couple's death, not just his, on the couple's death in 1952. Again, a similar story can be told about women behind another Courtauld ancestor, Sir Martin Conway, art historian, conservator, mountaineer, explorer, and the first Director General of the Imperial War Museum, whom we know as the donor of the core of the Conway Library of Photographs of Architecture and Decorative Arts. His long-suffering but highly intelligent daughter Agnes supported many of his projects, including this. I could go on, but there isn't time, and the message is clear enough and well rehearsed. Women's influence and actions, whether as artists or collectors, academics, librarians, secretaries, wives or daughters, have often remained hidden. Only gradually still are they being given their rightful place. But is this true when we come to our academic founder? Anthony Blunt is of a different era. As scholar and the director of the Courtauld for 24 years after the Second World War, he deserves that accolade. As he took on the role of director of the Courtauld in 1947, our other founders were reaching the ends of their lives. But his revelation as Soviet spy has relegated him to the shadows in our myth-making. There were certainly women in his life, not just Her Majesty the Queen, who was of course his other employer. But from the 1930s onwards, there were always key women at the Courtauld. So I end by raising my glass to those of the earlier years. To Margaret Winnie, Elizabeth Haslock, to Anita Bruckner, and to those many others without whom the Courtauld would not have become what it is today. Thank you.
Debbie, thank you so much for telling some of the story of women who I think are seldom mentioned in the triumvirate or maybe the quadriga of our founders. There's a question that maybe goes back to my mention of the Linda Nochlin essay. Francesca at @just_Fran has asked what we think, or what you think the responsibility is of museums in relation to that question about the prominence of women artists. What can we do, and what have we been doing at the Courtauld to show women artists and to teach them against a backdrop of a collection that is pretty fundamentally of works by male artists?
It's a real challenge. It's not just that well, number one, we need to build up further the collection with works by women artists. And I was going to mention another wonderful woman, very well known to us, Linda Carson, who I first ever talked about this issue with way back in 2004 at a meeting at my old women's college in Cambridge. And I'm delighted that some years later she became part of the collection, and so clearly that is part of what we need to do. But I think generally it's really being critical about what we are doing and explaining what we're doing, explaining why and where the women are very clearly, bringing them out, drawing them out. In this case, whether as collectors, I mean, maybe the collection, the earlier collection, there aren't that many women artists, but my goodness, there are women behind those artists, there are women behind those collectors. And that should be part of our storytelling. It should be very clearly there in our storytelling.
And we have made fairly major interventions in trying to extend the canon. For example, with the Georgiana Houghton, you talk about drawing women forward. I mean, that was a wonderful show of I think an artist that many people hadn't heard of.
And Gabriella Munter would be another example some years ago. So clearly our exhibition program is not constrained by the immediate collection, and we've given a lot of demonstration of that. And obviously it's there in all our teaching and research, tremendously.
And so a little bit later on in our program, we've got Ketty Gottardo, who I think is going to be able to share some works in our collection that also maybe help to address that collection. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Debbie. Debbie and I started the day in a mega 2-hour Teams meeting on screens, and we finished both wearing lipstick, which we weren't wearing this morning. So thank you very much for taking part, Debbie. And now I'm going to hand back to Katy to introduce our next speaker. I almost feel like there's sort of something Eurovision Song Contest about this. Come in, Katy. Katy, there. Okay.
I'm here. Thank you so much. That was so enlightening and just brilliant. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome our next guest, who is one of my favourite people and someone I've greatly admired for a number of years. It's Dr. Jo Applin. Jo Applin is a specialist in modern and contemporary art with a particular emphasis on American art since 1960. Jo's research addresses questions of abstraction, aging, eccentricity, feminism, sexuality, and subjectivity. She studied at Essex University and also at UCL, where she was subsequently Henry Moore postdoctoral fellow. She joined the Courtauld in 2016 after 11 years teaching history of art at the University of York, and she's currently the head of the History of Art department here at the Courtauld. Jo's talk is about aging women artists and contextualizing in the midst of a pandemic affecting vulnerable and old people over overwhelmingly. So I'm so excited to be welcoming Jo today. Is she here? Fantastic. Welcome, Jo.
And I'm really excited to talk a bit about this new project that I've been working on. So can you see my video?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and hello to everybody else. I hope everyone is safe and well. And I'm going to open with some questions. How does art affect our perception and experience of aging? What would an art history of aging look like beyond images of the aging body or late style? How does the work of art age, both in terms of its physical degradation and in terms of it registering as aged or out of date? These are just some of the questions I'm exploring in my new book about art, aging and feminism. I want to challenge the familiar, more hackneyed accounts of the 60s as a decade defined by youthful promise and revolt. And my project will explore how this was equally a time when the aging subject was placed under intense scrutiny by psychoanalysts, political activists, sociologists, and significantly, visual artists. My focus is on American artists of the 60s, which is also when and where the term ageism was first coined in 1969 by the psychoanalyst and renowned gerontologist Robert Butler. He proposed ageism as a correlate to the term racism in the midst of the civil rights era that saw minority groups fighting to be heard, seen, and afforded their rightful place. Butler highlighted the discrepancies and inequalities marking the life of older people, particularly those from within minority communities. With an average life expectancy that saw women in the period outliving men by on average 7 years, it was they, he pointed out, who bore the brunt of those economic, social and psychological problems for longer and often alone. It's often said that New York is a city only for the very rich and the very poor, noted the critic Joan Didion in her 1967 essay, Goodbye to All That. It's less often said that New York is also, at least for those of us who came there from somewhere else, a city only for the very young. Didion's essay was her elegiac farewell to the decade in which she herself came of age. Some 40 years later, aged 75, Didion reflected on her own aging process, on how hard it is to tell someone how old we are, how old we've become. Aging and its evidence remain life's most predictable events, yet they also remain matters we prefer to leave unmentioned, unexplored. The fact of the matter is, she wrote, I have made no adjustment whatsoever to aging. One artist who also made no adjustment to society's expectations about aging was the American artist May Wilson. In 1966, aged 61 years old, Wilson abruptly left the suburbs and moved to a room in the infamous Chelsea Hotel in New York, sometime home to Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac and others, where she lived for a time alongside many of the decade's leading and much younger countercultural figures. Wilson talked about how hard it was as an older woman to make a life for herself in the city, but also within the New York art world at that time, which was dominated by youth and all things new. Alongside making wrapped assemblage sculptures, can I have the next slide please? Wilson tackled head-on the subject of her own aging by visiting photo booths on 42nd Street, where she would pull funny faces for the camera, which she then cut and pasted onto postcard reproductions of other bodies. Have the next slide. Wilson called these her ridiculous portraits, and subject matter ranged from old master paintings to the Queen of England. Have the next slide, please. Okay, let's look at another example, this rather famous oil painting of pop artist Andy Warhol by Alice Neel, which Neel painted when she was 70 years old. Painted just 2 years after his near-fatal shooting, Neel depicts Warhol in a vulnerable position, his scars protected by a surgical corset. Neel famously had a knack for getting her subjects to undress, a particular feat in Warhol's case, as he was as insecure about aging as he was his own body. Next slide, please. I'm showing you here 2 Polaroids taken by Bridget Berlin during his sitting for Neel. His eyes are closed in the photos and painting, as though unable to face the reality of the situation, or perhaps his surrendering to the process of aging and being painted. Have the next slide, please. 10 years later, Neil, aged 80, made a self-portrait that we can think of as a pendant piece to the Warhol one. Each has an air of being unfinished, as though a work in progress, because of course artworks are made and change over time like people. Notice how Neil meets our gaze head on. It's a direct challenge, but also a glorious celebration of her own aging body. Of course, we're all always aging, and age is always relative. Interestingly though, it tends to be youth and old age that get the most attention, with middle age rarely addressed. But for artists, middle age is usually the exact point where they might hope to receive their first major retrospective exhibition in a museum or gallery, although women artists fare less well in that regard, often receiving their first retrospectives far later in life than their male counterparts. Can I have a slide, please? Louise Bourgeois, to take a well-known example, had to wait until she was 70 before receiving her first major retrospective exhibition at MoMA in New York in 1982. Here she is. Can I have the next slide, please? Here she is holding her abstract erotic sculpture, provocatively titled A Ma Fillette, or My Little Girl, tucked under her arm. This photo was cropped for the exhibition catalogue so that the phallic form was edited out, turning Bourgeois' original rather wicked smile, shared with the photographer Robert Mapplethorpe, into a rather more benign and perhaps acceptable image of a smiling old lady. And a chief aim of my project is to challenge the idea that the goal of later life is to age successfully or to age well. It's a morally weighted imperative linked to the notion that we should act our age. I side instead with artists who questioned such directives, who instead elected to age and behave badly, whether through resistance or refusal, or conversely, those whose art affirms a riotous reclamation, even celebration of the aging process. Can I have the next slide, please? Such as the young American pop artist Jan Howarth's quilted fabric sculptures of old people, which pushed against the grain of pop's enchantment with youth. Beatles fans among you might have noticed Howarth's granny sitting in the front row on the cover of their 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. She's got a stuffed doll of Shirley Temple on her knees. The 60s is frequently cast today as a decade that shaped a privileged demographic deemed by a younger generation to have benefited most from the post-war settlement and opportunities it afforded. But I want to challenge the tacit ageism of too easy assumptions about generational conflict and tribalism, with boomers pitched against millennials. Can I have the next slide, please? In recent months, the COVID-19 pandemic's effect on the elderly and inequalities it's reinforced across communities relating both to race and class has given these debates a very contemporary and tragic complexion. And an artist who I've been thinking about for a long time is Yayoi Kusama, who burst onto the New York art scene in the 1960s. And I'll leave you with the now 91-year-old's most recent offering from lockdown, a poem to the world in the time of coronavirus. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jo. That was so interesting. I mean, you brought up some of my absolute favourite artists, someone Louise Bourgeois, who we spoke at length, and actually after hearing you speak about Louise Bourgeois, I was just amazed about how she kept reinventing herself. I think that's an amazing aspect of it as well. But I'd love to ask you about, other examples of artists you might be looking at. I mean, you mentioned that, race is a really important aspect of your work. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So another artist that I've been teaching for a good few years now, and who we're very excited to bring to the Courtauld is Howardina Pindell. And I'm really interested in how we can think about some of these issues in relation to abstract art, that I don't just want this to be about images of old ladies, right? Although perhaps that is exactly where I'm headed. And I was really interested in Pindell's, move between working in abstraction and then her video works. And there's her particular video work where she is recounting her experiences throughout her life, racist experiences that she encountered. And in the video, she alternates between playing herself and playing in kind of whiteface, a kind of white middle class art critic interviewer that keeps challenging her. No, that doesn't sound racist to me. And she would say, when I was 5, when I was 12, and each time give an incident of racism that she experienced growing up. And for me, this is a really interesting form of kind of life writing, which is something that's really important to feminism and to a lot of women artists. And within the field of gerontology, the study of old age, there's a lot of work that was done in the 60s around the idea of the life review, and this idea that towards the end of our life, or when we're older, it's actually really therapeutically important to be encouraged to recount your life story as a way of coming to terms with who you are and where you're headed. And I just was thinking this is a really interesting way of thinking questions of biography and the career, when you suddenly think about an artist's own practice as a form of life review. And these studies also go on to say, well, of course, we know that the elderly can sometimes have a tendency to ramble. And I just thought this idea of reminiscence and ramble that's got this therapeutic term also is a really neat way of thinking themes of repetition that we talk about a lot in this kind of avant-garde language. And so Haradina Pindell is important, and also Lorraine O'Grady in 2010 did a wonderful work, which was through the public programs at Tate, which was Ask Me Anything You Want About Aging. And she invited people to submit questions so they could have a kind of consciousness raising session about this kind of subject. So there are two other artists I'm thinking about.
Absolutely. And we've got just one audience question, if that's okay. This is from Caroline Kavanagh at CA Kavanagh. This is a really interesting one because it's talking about the Guerrilla Girls, who were really prominent in the 80s. I know they're still very much around here, but in 1989 they did ask, do women have to be naked to get into the Met Museum? And Caroline asked, bought this magnet at Tate quite some time ago. How do we and museums improve the lack of women artists displayed? Which I think comes in quite nicely with your ageism as well.
It does. I mean, it's a great question. And honestly, I think it's one that is really, it is being redressed. I mean, I think we've seen some completely amazing retrospectives. And I think that Frances Morris has done an amazing job at Tate Modern in doing this. So it feels sort of quite optimistic in some ways. I feel that we are seeing more and more artists and more diverse artists, and also not just women artists, but artists from perhaps working in traditions and forms that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see, or that we weren't necessarily taught as art history students. So I do think that it is the case. And I think things like your podcast and talking with my students, hello, I think they're all out there, you know, this feels absolutely urgent and obvious that we should be talking about.
People are hungry for this knowledge as well.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jo. I'm going to pass us back to Elise now.
Okay.
But thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Jo.
Thank you so much, Jo. It's just been a real joy over the past few years working with Jo to kind of see her thinking develop about this project. And actually, one thing you won't know, unless one of my colleagues has already tweeted it, just before we kicked off tonight, Jo sent a photograph. I asked everyone to send a photograph of themselves where they were going to be transmitting from, and we could all see in Jo's photograph that her screen is propped up by the most impressive stack of books, all on the subject of age and aging and its intersection with feminist art history. So thank you so much, Jo. And now it's my really tremendous pleasure to introduce another one of my treasured Courtauld colleagues, Dr. Ketty Gottardo, who is the Martin Halusa Curator of Drawings in our gallery. And she is the core of Ketty's research interest is really old master prints and drawings, about which she has a really formidable knowledge. But her interest in prints and drawings goes in both chronological directions, and it's a real pleasure to look at things with her. And anytime I have a question about the collection, she instantly sends me images and informative information. So informative information. Well, you know what I'm saying. Anyway, now Ketty, can you join our screen? There you are. Hi, with a much healthier cheese plant, if that's what that is, than I have. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I'm just going to hand over to you.
Yes, so I will be starting by sharing my screen. Let's see here.
Should I reappear to keep you company during this transition?
Sorry, yeah, here we go.
You got it.
All right. You can see it, right?
I can just see you. I can't see your slides yet.
Oh, I thought we were sharing. Okay, and now?
Not yet.
Huh.
Not yet, but you are wearing my favorite necklace that you have. So, I mean, yeah. Swings and roundabouts for me. I wonder if one of my research forum colleagues who's behind the scenes has Ketty's slide deck. You need to, so Ketty, yeah, there you go.
All right. All right.
Just press play. Yeah, there you go. Okay, I'll shut up now.
All right. Okay, so I would like to begin with these two images, which show upper left where this event would have normally have taken place as part of ResFest, the research festival organized by the Research Forum. It shows our current prints and drawings study room at Vernon Square, where most of the works that I will show you shortly would have been displayed there on easels, allowing everyone to study them from up close. On the right is where we will be welcoming you from 2021 in our soon-to-be refurbished study room at Somerset House, where you will be able to see prints and drawings from the gallery's collection, covering most European schools and a little but growing collection of North American works. The collection has only few works by female artists, but in recent years, the Courtauld was lucky enough to acquire a group of drawings by Helen Saunders through the generous gift of Bridget Pepping, Saunders' first cousin twice removed, and principal scholar of the artist's work. Helen Saunders may not be a familiar name, but she played a key role as one of only two female artists within the radical art movement called vorticism. She was at the heart of avant-garde art in London in the turbulent years before and during First World War. Before joining the vorticist movement, Saunders trained with the artist Rosa Waugh, another female artist who at 21 had set up her own teaching studio for women. She also briefly trained at the Slade School of Arts and later at the Central School of Arts and Crafts. Saunders was deeply inspired by Roger Fry's two post-impressionist exhibitions in 1910 and 1912, and began working on less representational and more abstract works, exhibiting within the circle of the Bloomsbury Group. Fry, in fact, invited Saunders to contribute to a show he organized in Paris in 1912, where Saunders' work was shown alongside those by Duncan Grant, Vanessa Bell, and Wyndham Lewis. This artistic phase was soon to be replaced by works that were clearly influenced by Cubism, such as Hammock, seen here at left, where the features and body of the female figure lying on a hammock are reminiscent of works by Picasso and Braque from around 1908. In this work, as well as in another drawing from that period, here on the right, shapes are determined and emphasized by broad, strong black outlines. 1914 would be a pivotal year in Saunders' career. In that year, in fact, she joined the vorticist movement, which launched from the newly created Rebel Art Center, where revolutionary ideas and teaching non-representational art were promoted. Wyndham Lewis was its provocateur and self-established leader. Lewis had just left another avant-garde group, the Omega Workshop, in outspoken disagreement with Omega's founder, Roger Fry. The name vorticism was coined by the poet and art critic Ezra Pound. The vorticist published a manifesto in July 1914 in a newly created magazine called Blast. Here on the screen you see the cover of the second and last edition. Along with Lewis and Saunders, the other artists were the sculptors Jacob Epstein, Henry Gaudier-Brechka, and the painter Edward Wordsworth. The other female artist, besides Saunders, was Jessica Dismore. Together with the other members, Saunders signed the manifesto and contributed with designs. Her poem titled A Vision of Mud was also published in the second and last edition of July 1915. Although short-lived because of the outbreak of the First World War, vorticism remains one of the most influential and fully engaged art movements in Britain. Vorticism wanted to create a new art for a new world. that was born out of modern society. The new art rejected the past and favored geometric abstract style, hard-edged imagery that derived from the surrounding urban environment and expressed a certain fascination with the machine. It was believed that it should embody the dynamism of the city and reject the natural landscape. If stylistically one could see their principles in close proximity with the manifesto of Futurism and stylistically with the shapes of Cubism, Vorticism wanted to distance itself from these two movements. Saunders embraced it fully and showed works in the two London exhibitions, as well as one organized in New York in 1917 that was organized by Ezra Pound. Her work in those years was characterized by abstraction, as is seen in this drawing on the screen, where the composition is constructed of angles and straight lines and overlap of trapezoid shapes. This work, which is currently exhibited at our partner institution, the Harris Museum in Preston, in the Artful Line exhibition, is a study for a design illustrated in the second issue of the magazine Blast. Though we might want to try to see objects in these forms and interpret them in different ways, the vorticist thinking that Saunders embraced conceived that shapes and their relationships have a meaning of their own apart from any literary or representational overtones. Clearly, there is a sense of urgency in these forms, and their angular shapes fittingly convey a sense of unrest. I'd like to show you also these two extraordinarily vibrant vorticist works by Saunders, which in an evocative way hint at the rare presence of figures. Saunders' work from this period is rare, and it is thought, in fact, that a considerable percentage has sadly not survived. What remains is a small number of really striking works on paper, some of which were considered to be finished works in their own right and exhibited as such. I'll conclude by briefly showing a couple of works that showcase how Saunders' work changed after the end of the vorticist movement. The landscape on the left represents her work from the 1920s, a period from which mainly her watercolors have survived. Some showing L'Estaque, a village in southern France, west of Marseille, where artists such as Cézanne, Braque, and Dufy had previously worked. While the portrait on the right represents Blanche Caldwell, whom the artist met around 1908, and with whom she shared a flat from 1933 until Caldwell's death in 1950. Blanche was Saunders' most frequent sitter and featured in several of her portraits from the 1930s and 1940s. Saunders' avant-garde years fell into relative obscurity after the war. With a revival of interest in vorticism during the 1970s, her work has re-emerged, though her figure was still overshadowed by her male contemporaries, and especially Wyndham Lewis. It is only in more recent years that her work has started to be fully reassessed and finally being recognized as a vital contribution to modernist art at the beginning of the 20th century.
Ketty, thank you so much. It feels so unnatural to me not to clap after such a fantastic exposition of an artist that I think many of us won't know at all well, if at all. I mean, the vorticists so often seem like the kind of ultra-masculine art movement. So this, I think, complicates that maybe impression that ignorant medievalists such as myself might have.
Well, I must say, I also learned about her and their work only since I joined the Courtauld, and when I discovered that we were lucky enough to have really an important group of drawings by her. But if the memory of her work has been forgotten for some years, she was quite involved with the movement, and especially with the publication of Blast, of the magazine, part of which was actually distributed from her own flat. So clearly, yes, there was a real commitment from her to art and to the movement. And she worked, as I said, alongside Jessica Dismore. So it is significant that there were two female artists in that group.
Well, I hope we'll have a chance to learn more about them and maybe see more of their work when the Courtauld Gallery reopens. We've got a question from, so I have to put my glasses on to read, so tiny, Laura Segal, at Laura Segal, who is asking a kind of really, I think, kind of profound question that I know we talk about all the time at work, which is about what you think is the best way on the level of curating exhibitions to ensure that women are included, that women's work is seen, and that we can, I'm just paraphrasing now, so, you know, surface the work of women who have maybe, you know, a little bit like Helen Saunders and Jessica Dismore, maybe been relegated somewhat more to footnotes than to the main body of the text.
Yeah, so as Katy was saying earlier, we are surfing a good wave, I think, right now. But for what concerns us, the Courtauld, I think that we are quite aware, as I said earlier, that our collection has very few female representatives. But I mean, personally, I'm sort of working towards enriching that part of the collection, and it will be a nice surprise that we will be able to to talk about fairly soon, with hopefully a new group of drawings by a female American artist who will be joining the collection. So stay tuned.
That's very exciting teaser for the future. Okay, well, thank you so much. I hope you have a good rest of the evening. Give your charismatic plan to cuddle from me, and I'm gonna hand back to Katy now.
Hi.
Are you there, Katy? There you go.
God, that was so interesting. I'd never even heard of her, and I'm just dying when the Courtauld reopens and we can see these drawings.
Yeah, I mean, podcasts are always possible in the
Yes.
interval, I suppose. I mean, I don't, you know, I don't want to tell you your business, but you might have a good story here.
So now I'm so delighted to say that we are welcoming Jade Montserrat to perform this evening as the final brilliant roundup of this fantastic evening. Jade is an alumna of the Courtauld Institute of Art and is the recipient of the Stuart Hall Foundation Scholarship, which supports her PhD on race and representation in North Britain in the context of Black Atlantic, a creative practice product and the development of her work from her Black diasporic perspective in the north of England. Tonight, Jade is actually reacting to one of the most iconic works in the Courtauld collection. It's Gauguin's Rerioa, which I'm so excited. And oh, welcome, Jade, welcome. My gosh, what a beautiful backdrop you have. So just before Jade performs, we have a couple of questions for her as well. Thank you so much again for being here tonight. So Jade, congratulations on your solo exhibition at Innova back in January and February. Your work here, a series of watercolours and drawings, were in dialogue with the context of the Stuart Hall Library. This in turn amplified the multitude of voices in a perpetual generative reverberation. I mean, as an artist and researcher in this pandemic, how are you still working to draw on these connections?
Well, most recently I did a watercolour that for a packet of seeds for wildflower seeds. So I think that that's a connection. They're going to be distributed through a magazine. So, but that's something that locates all of us, or could. That's the potential anyway. Yeah, on that kind of base level. Really.
Definitely. And it's interesting that as a women artist, and this is about women artists in an hour, you know, you are reacting to a work by the male artist Gauguin. I mean, through your practice, you will be reinstating women's voices through stories of the subjects. Could you tell us why you chose this painting in particular?
Yeah, I really like pattern and colour, and I also, for my GCSE, I inserted my head into the bathers, the two bathers, two women on the beach, and did this big painting. And I've searched high and low because I do have the photo of me looking really insolent like this. So I wanted to return to Gauguin because I don't know an awful lot about him, but I was inclined towards the paintings, that surface, that sort of flat surface, and the pattern and the colour. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, fantastic. Well, we'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and it's so good to meet have met all of you through this. Thanks so much for hosting this new thing, whatever it is. Thanks. Feminist, a person that believes in the social, economic, and political equality of all genders. Fawcett Society, UK-based charity campaigning for women's rights and gender equality, announced in January 2019 that gender is the most common cause of hate crime in the UK. Imperialism, an economic movement, a racist economic impulse, primitivism, a Western art movement that normally took inspiration from non-Western art practices, normally producing racist or simplified stereotypes of the people that it generally depicted. Paul Gauguin is a particularly good example. Interior of a hut in Tahiti. Here the humidity, the rest, the hut. Coarse weave. Gauguin wrote to his friend that a woman out there is, so to speak, obligata, which will provide me with an everyday model. Taking a wife, Gauguin's every woman became a form of private property in a domestic space. Griselda Pollock, Courtauld alum and post-colonial feminist scholar, describes the relationship as a legalized exploitation of a sexual body for reproduction. His body, her body owned, her body his, marketable woman, cook for me woman, subordinate other, pray and cipher, pray and prayed. What a woman should be like, an inescapable place, the energy, the involvement of European masculine sexuality, outlined, intoxicated reverence for style, flattening all perspective, flat planes, obsolete planes, planes clogged by niceties and etiquettes and triggered borders, flat picture plane, flat earth, views from Port Merion, ordered, contained, linear, toys, dolls and spectres. Yes, I'll show you my tit whilst I lotus rest from sun toil, garden toil, tilling toil, sewing and sewing toil. My nudity is not your truth, it's mine. Your truth is recording what remains of a world conquered by poisonous eyes, liked what they saw, took what they saw. Knowing. I see you, I see you, I see you. Touchy, touchy-feely, edging for the exit. Here, but not here. Fantasist, who you fathered. Illustrating the reality of the fantasy, she falls towards you, extractive outsider status, desired body of consumption, the depth of a fantasist, the flatness of nationalism and empire, advanced European art, wealth industrialists and bourgeois collectors, I love you, I love you, I love you, a circuit of mutual services and complicity, conquest mentality, humanity reduced to a monologue, the printed page eradicating our history, watch Black lives annotating. I see myself, our hope is intact, struggle against this history daily. Everywhere she lives is remote. No map could show the great silence, mining our experience. Agency is a total illusion, kept at the periphery, only just over the threshold. Improvement, structures maintained, whiteness. Anti-blackness is its central remit to demonstrate the universal superiority of European culture. Resist, an art historical canon ingested, regurgitated. Seeing is the chastity they submit to. Existing imperialist narratives, humiliation of the white man, shame laid thick, congested responsibility. Who is the child that has been callously rejected? How do we accommodate violence? Quit talking to you as things. Action met with recognized silence, recognized inaction, negative space that connects individual and institutional racisms, accepted with a shrug but erodes the soul, an urgent response to the mechanism, the absented curriculum. Why is it that we do not nationally understand our history of racism, that it is contested? What is hindering our development? Why are our structures so resilient? The racialized categorization of human subjects is one of the most resilient forms of global genocide. The 17th and 18th centuries whipped up a glorious mess in terms of feasting on a maelstrom of fantastic ideas pertaining to race, including Carl von Linnaeus's Systema Naturae and Friedrich Blumenbach's On the Natural Variety of Mankind, both gouging out ground to ascribe classifications through racialized criterion. Their calculations developed alongside the representation and packaging of Black people. As Patrine Archer-Shaw explains in her book Negrophilia, it was only by presenting them as different and exotic, by showing them as slaves, servants, entertainers, and humorous characters related to animals, that their racial inferiority could be communicated. Advertising fed off these fears of difference into safe, accessible images where whites were given control. For instance, it made Black savagery cuddly in the form of the gollywog, the most popular Black caricature in late 19th century England. Conversely, it enhanced the Black female libido with naked imagery that vacillated between the French writer Charles Baudelaire's Venus Noire and Aunt Jemima's generous Black mama persona, representing abundant nature and the tradition of wet nursing. Remote posterity, holistic remedy, racial justice training, understandings of philanthropy, its contradictions and alignment with structural institutionalized racisms, a paradox of sorts in a bureaucratic age of diversity, asks us to interrogate how and why our culture is wedded to erase the erasure of violences when tied to philanthropy, which continues to buy absolution and legacy. When David Olusoga asks, can you buy your reputation in perpetuity? He goes on to situate the question in an idea that this can only be approached as a transparent, collaborative and dichotomous process, locating and vocalizing memory, and as an imperative, a possible caveat in a social contract between us all, with a shared pain and discomfort, a shared healing. I interpret Olusoga's words as a need to be together, with the absences, assumptions, prejudices, linguistic tricks, cognitive distancing. These social constructs inducing collective trauma might be pathologized as a culture convulsing, from socially engineered gaslighting. Thus far, avoidance, divisionary tactics, isolating behaviors, a need to conquer by those who have profited from privilege. What am I going to do about it? Saidiya Hartman's clarification of the rupturing legacy of the transatlantic trade in African humans is also important to recall here. She states, the simple fact was that we still lived in a world in which racism sorts the haves and have-nots and decides who lives and who dies. Racism, according to Michael Foucault, is the social distribution of death. Like an actuarial chart, it predicts who would thrive and who would not. Blacks are twice more likely to die than whites at every stage of life and have shorter lifespans. This leads to questions arising from how Blackness is pathologized. Last year, I watched a BBC video called BAME Communities Unequal Mental Health Care. Adina Campbell reported that people from Africa and Caribbean backgrounds are 3 to 5 times more likely to be diagnosed or admitted into hospital for schizophrenia than white patients. And there's a greater chance of ethnic minorities overall being offered medication rather than talking therapies for mental health conditions. Also at a higher risk of ending up in crisis rather than accessing support sooner through a GP. BAME people are also more likely to be detained. Mental health issues anaesthetized at the expense of further body autonomy erosion, enabled by neoliberal globalization, the capitalization of mental instability that scarcity and dehumanization inflict. The horror of pathology bound to racial categorization is nowhere more sensitively brought to the fore, perhaps, than in Hartman's chapter, A Minor Figure. The chapter reminds the reader of the kinds of terrible things that could be done to a Black girl without a crime having occurred. We are invited to join Hartman in a forensic reading of a painful photograph. A very young, unidentified black girl lies naked on a chaise longue looking directly at the photographer. Hartman thinks about the kinds of touch that cannot be refused. In 1883, the age of consent was 10. Previous immorality meant a man could do whatever he wanted. Coloured girls were always presumed to be immoral. We do well to heed her observation that the entanglement in violence and sexuality, care and exploitation continues to define the meaning of being black and female. My poem ends with a quotation from Catherine Yusof, writer and geographer, who approaches race as a geological proposition and suggests conceiving of blackness as a historically constituted, intentionally enacted deformation in the formation of subjectivity, a deformation that presses an inhuman characterization and the inhuman earth into intimacy, adding it is predicated on the presumed absorbent qualities of black and brown bodies to take up the body burdens of exposure to toxicities and to buffer, excuse me, sorry. Sorry. And to buffer the violence of the earth, literally stretching black and brown bodies across the seismic fault lines of the earth. Black Anthropocenes subtend white geology as a material stratum. With thanks to Adam Smythe, Megan Thee Stallion's Track Savage, and Happy Talk from the 1958 film version of South Pacific. Ta.
Jade, thank you so much for what was, I think, for me anyway, a very cathartic encounter with a poem that, like you used the phrase, the hurt, which I think is one of the things that I always think about when I see it. It's not an easy watch, that picture. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And we're now, every time we have an Open Courtauld Hour, I wind up saying it's the Open Courtauld slightly more than an hour by the end. And so I'm gonna round out this first series that we've done of Open Courtauld Hour by thanking people for taking part. I want to thank the audience, first of all. Thank you all for joining us. We've been able to connect with thousands of people over the last 4 weeks. And it's been really wonderful. New people that we've never engaged with before have joined these broadcasts, and also a lot of old friends from around the world. And that's been a really special thing for all of us working on it. I want to thank the participants tonight, maybe beginning with Jade. Thank you again, Jade, Ketty, Jo, Debbie, and really especially my co-host tonight, Katy Hessel. It's been such a pleasure to meet you, a real joy, and I hope we'll be able to get you back, snare you into another one of these in the future. So this is the end of this series. We're going to be coming back with more this summer, and then with another series already in the works for the autumn. But in the meantime, stay in touch with us on social media at Courtauld Res on Twitter and Instagram. And also, if what you've seen tonight or in the past few weeks inspires you to want to support the work we do at the Courtauld, head to our webpage and click on the support tab at the top. Like most charitable institutions, we are hurting a bit in the financial crisis. We're doing the best we can, though, and any support that you can give us is going to go to the larger project of sharing the history of art and conservation with all of the people. So anyway, it's not too late to get out into your garden or out into the street to enjoy the evening. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Bye.